That was very efficient. So good morning again, and welcome everyone. We're really grateful to have this opportunity to share with you some of the projects that we've been working on in the Cultural Selection Lab at the University of North Texas. Today we have 3 presentations planned proposals for projects that the 3 students will be completing for their master's thesis requirement in the master's behavior analysis here. The first student will be Thomas Urbina, the second Carlos Lopez, and the third Stephanie Cran, and they will each take a little bit of time to introduce themselves to you before they get started. The way we want to conduct the format today is that each of the students will take about 15 or 20 minutes to present, and then we will pause at the end of each presentation so that we can have 15 to 20 minutes to discuss each presentation before moving to the next. Then at the end of toward the end of the meeting, we'll have some time for more general or open discussion. And so since the students are on a pretty tight timeline for conveying the important details of their studies that they're planning to run, we'd ask that you hold the questions until that discussion point at the end of each presentation. So with that brief introduction, we will, you guys don't have to do anything to add people. As they come in, they'll come in, and I can monitor some things from the other computer that I have going on as well in terms of the chat. So with that brief introduction, then I'm going to go ahead and let Thomas come up and get us started for this morning.
All right, so can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, I see nods. Awesome. Okay, so hi, my name's Thomas Urbina. I'm a 3rd-year master's student here at UNT. I've been working with Tracy for the past couple of years in education mostly. I don't need to worry about that, right?
Nope.
And more recently, I'm exploring what's going on in the cultural analysis world and exploring some of that work there. So I'll talk to you guys a little bit about what I'm interested in looking at. Is it shared?
You have to do share screen in Zoom. So go back to Zoom.
So go back to this. Share.
And then go into presentation. Perfect.
All right, cool. And move this box. There we go. Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk to you guys about can variability of interlocking behavioral contingencies be selected? Right, and why even look at variability? Well, there's a lot of implications outside of behavior analysis. You can think of scenarios in your own life where it might be useful to try and approach a problem, right, in a different way, or try to do something a little bit different than how you've been doing it. And this variability oftentimes could come in handy, right? And this also applies to organizations like sports teams or businesses. You can imagine, right, someone running a business, they run things a particular way, and that works, right, for the most part. But, you know, consumer demand changes, the economy shifts, whatever it is, they might have to engage in a variety of different behaviors in order to stay in business. Otherwise, if they stick to those rigid way of doing things, they'll probably go out of business, right? So there's a lot of scenarios where you might want more variable responding, or scenarios where you might want a little bit less of that, right? And I thought, you know, it might be cool, right, from a behavior analytics standpoint, could we understand some of those conditions under which people or groups might behave in a more variable way? How can they, why are some groups more susceptible to change and do things differently, whereas others might be a little more stuck in their ways? Right, so you have to start a little bit close to home with looking at operant variability and some of Nuringer's work. Him and his colleagues, right, were interested in how variability works at the operant level and looking at different parameters that might promote or quote unquote reinforce variability, right? So in a series of experiments with pigeons where the response of interest was key pecks, right, a sequence of key pecks, how can we get the pigeons to vary their responses or to engage in novel instances of key pecks? And they would manipulate things like the schedules of reinforcement, some of those antecedent variables in order to get more variable responding. What's going to be a little more relevant to what I'm doing is the manipulation they had was a lag schedule of reinforcement. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar, just the lag schedule is the criterion for reinforcement is dependent on the nth response. So if you have a lag 2 schedule, reinforcement is going to be contingent on whatever this response is being different than the previous 2 responses and so on. And then I decided to, look up at what's being done at the culturant level when looking at variability, if that's something we're exploring. And there's a lot of things that are relevant, but these two studies here really stick out to what I'm doing in particular. So looking at Vasconcelos and Totoro, they were exploring what kind of apparatus could we use to manipulate variables more readily, right? How can we explore what's going on at the meta-contingency level with this apparatus that they set up right here? So they have this chessboard, and the way they conceptualized it was these two pieces moving on the board would be considered the interlocking behavioral contingencies, right? Those IBCs. And whenever they met up on the board in adjacent cells, that would be conceptualized as the aggregate product. And then what they would do is deliver some sort of cultural consequence, a congratulations, end of trial, or you win, right? Contingent on those IBC and AP interactions. So what they explored was aggregate product variability index. So across a couple of conditions where they just let the participants move around the board, no consequences delivered, and then another condition in which they place the cultural consequence contingent on meeting on a particular part of the board, and then another condition where they just had an end of trial on some meetings and not others. So the big takeaway here is that the aggregate product had some variability in the control condition where they were just allowed to move anywhere, and they had a little bit more stereotypic meetings where the cultural consequence was contingent on certain parts on the board. So with that, it's a good demonstration of how a meta contingency could be studied using this particular paradigm. And what Carvalho and colleagues did was take that a little bit further, right? They decided to keep using that program called Zadras and explore some other other measures of IBC variability, and try to explore how can we look at that, right, using this. So when they explored IBC variability, they're doing the same exact IBCs and APs as the previous study, right? Players are moving, and then they meet up for some aggregate product, and then they get the parabens, which is congratulations, and that's what they explored. So for variability of the IBCs, they looked at the standard deviation of the moves. So a standard deviation of 0 might say that they did the exact same IBC move, the exact same number of IBC movements as the previous instance or throughout the trial. So the way this relates to what I'm interested in is, well, when looking at that as a measure of variability, you can have a standard deviation of 2, 2, 2, or 2, 3, 4, but the number of moves doesn't necessarily indicate how different those IBCs are. They, two instances of 2 could still be different because there's multiple ways to get to an aggregate product, at least in this particular setup. So that leads into what I was interested in asking was, can the culturants, right, those IBCs and APs, and specifically the form of the IBCs, be selected through manipulations of schedules of cultural consequence delivery? The other thing is, can variability and stereotypy of IBCs be reliably brought under contextual control through the manipulation of stimuli that precede the emission of a culturant that correlate with a cultural consequence, right? So those things that happen before the IBC and AP emission, and then how does stereotypic IBCs compare with variable IBCs in terms of meeting the contingencies? So what my IV independent variable and dependent variables are listed here. So what I'm manipulating are those preceding stimuli, right? Those some background colors, and a cultural consequence, similar to the previous setups. It's just a congratulations. And what I'm really interested in measuring is those the topography of those IBCs, right? So those moves made between the two participants, right? How do those vary under different conditions? And then, of course, the aggregate product, the meetings on the board, where are they meeting, and how are they getting there? Right, and this is the program, Zadras, courtesy of Todorov and Rafaela. They agreed to let me use it. It was in Portuguese, but that's fine because we have plenty of translators here to help us out. So it's been fun learning how this program works. And what I was able to do was mess with some of these parameters to try and cater it to what it is I'm trying to explore. Right? So here's what the preparation looks like now, right? You have the two players who start off, right? Yellow and red, and yellow always goes first. And the way they move is, if anyone's familiar with chess, they move very similar to a knight. So it'd be two movements or two squares, two cells in any direction, and then one cell on any adjacent cell. So here you can kind of see it. Yellow is going to go first, and you kind of see the two options that this yellow player has, right? So they can move two over here, down one, and that would be one movement, or they can move two down here and one over it, and that could also be a movement. And after that player moves, this player over here will have the same option. They'll be able to go two here, up here, or two here, one over. So the way this might look, right, in one of my conditions in which I'm trying to select, right, for some variability in these forms, there's a couple of different outcomes that might play into it, right? So they meet, right, say they meet like this. Here's the contingency, right? The IBCs, they meet up in the middle, produce that aggregate product of the meeting. Congrats, delivered contingent on that. You see over here a hits and misses counter, and it shows that they did well. Another possibility, right, is since we're selecting for, or we're trying to select for variability, as long as they're differing in their IBCs, it'll produce that congrats, right? But the aggregate product doesn't necessarily need to be different because, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of ways to get to the aggregate product. This is just one instance here where you have the same aggregate product as the first instance, albeit a little bit more complicated, but it is still a way to get to that aggregate product and would count, at least in our scenario, as a variable IBC. And then in another condition in which we're trying to select for more stereotypic responding, right? They'll be presented with different backgrounds, same setup, same rules, meet in any adjacent square, and you'll get the cultural consequence, and you're trying to get as many of those as possible. So like before, this is what we want to see, right? But in theory, we want to see this over and over, right? We want the same type of IBCs, which inevitably produce the same aggregate product. So unlike the previous condition, there's a little less flexibility with the aggregate product, in that it has to be similar each time in order to produce that cultural consequence, right? So if either or both of the participants vary in their responding, it'll count as a miss, and they wouldn't produce the congratulations or the congrats. Right, so this is sort of a visual of what the contingencies look like in each condition. So walking through this, here we have just a control condition, right? There's no program stimuli, it's just both players moving their pieces, any meeting on the board, it's all good. And they'll produce a congratulations on any meeting, right? And that would be our control condition. And the B condition, which we're trying to select for that variability, as far as the culturing goes, we don't want the IBC to be similar to the previous IBCs, right? So this is similar to a lag one schedule seen in the operant variability literature. And for the aggregate product, we see any meeting on the board works, even if it is the same meeting, those IBCs could still vary, right? And there'll be no consequence delivery if the IBC does not differ from the previous trial. And in the last condition, I'm sure you saw this coming, we're trying to select for more stereotypic responding or less variable responding, where the IBC is similar to the previous IBC. And like I said, the aggregate product will inevitably be the same because it's the same IBC, right? So no consequence delivery if it differs from the previous. And that's essentially what the C condition is, right? The stereotypic responding, variable responding, and then our control condition, right? So what we thought about is maybe approaching this with a reversal design, right? ABC, ABC, and then ACB or ACB and ACB, right? To kind of counter control, because there's some literature that suggests for participants who encounter the variability condition first are more likely to vary in subsequent conditions. And in some of the meta-contingency literature that use this particular paradigm, they had 15 trials for some of their conditions. So we thought that might be a decent place to start for each of the conditions and how responding might emerge, right? What kind of patterns might we see? We might need to make it longer, but I played it a couple times with other people and it's fairly quick. So we're still exploring that. Like I mentioned earlier, the goal is to move the pieces such that they meet at any two cells on the board that are adjacent horizontally, diagonally, or vertically, right? So that's our IBC, right? This sequence, the movements between the two participants, and to reiterate, the IV preceding stimuli and the cultural consequence, the DV, IBC, and the AP. Some loose ends, some things that I am not particularly sure about. Programming a lag one schedule, right? Sounds simple enough, but I'm a naive coder. By that, I mean I know nothing about coding. Representation of the data, because I'm going to show you the data right now and what that looks like and what it is that the program actually spits out. A lot of useful information, but how to organize it is a different question. Right, so I don't know if this makes sense to anybody, but this is what the code looks like. If you were to click this drop-down arrow, there would be a ton of options that open up different pages of code. A little overwhelming on my end, but yeah, this is, like I said, maybe that makes sense to somebody. You could shoot me an email. That doesn't, you don't have to. Representation of the data, this is what it spits out, right? So in theory, right, condition here, this could be A, this could be B, this could be C, this could be A, right? And what it tracks is the duration of the entire thing, of course, and how long each player takes to move, where they move, and then the moment they meet that cultural consequence. And then, of course, you could always record the screen and record their movements as they're actually doing it, right? So this would be set up, but I'm imagining this over here on the left-hand side is probably the variables of, or the data that I would try to graph, right? Because these are the cells, right? So cell 3-2 or cell 7-6, right? Similar to chess, if anyone's played chess, it's telling you exactly where on the board that they are meeting. But yeah, that's what I got. Thank you guys for listening. Appreciate it. And then we have time for questions if anyone is, and discussion if anyone has anything. Right, look at that night. Isn't that night cool? That's my favorite.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi, Thomas. This is Rita speaking. And I'm just curious about the procedure. And I would like to know what kind of instruction you're going to give your players, if they are allowed to discuss. And Maybe this is one a missing part from me, because you said that congratulation is going to be considered as the cultural consequence. Why? Which I understood you took from another paper, which I admit I didn't read. So why, if you can tell me in what sense you would define this congratulation as a cultural consequence rather than usually we define this as a social, or you know. So mainly this, yeah. What kind of instructions your players are going to get, and if they know about variability, or and if they can discuss in a certain point or not. And that's it. Thank you.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, great question. I probably should have clarified the instructions part for sure. What the instructions would be, it's like it's the same instructions that were kind of given in the previous sets of papers that use the study. So it's just like, welcome, you're about to play a game with another participant. Your goal is to meet on any two adjacent cells on the board. And if you do that, you'll get the message, right? The you win, the congratulations. And your goal, right, as participants is to get as many of those you wins as possible, right? So they're not necessarily aware of the contingencies in place. They don't know about, oh, you need to do something different each time. They don't know that you need to do something the same each time. And that's part of what we're exploring with the preceding variables, right? Is this particular setup going to select for them to vary their responses or not? They are allowed to talk to each other. I was also curious about that as well. Looking at the previous literature, it says that they're just next to each other. They sit next to each other. They're on the same computer and they're both clicking, and the experimenters there behind them just monitoring. But there was never anything about, oh, they're not allowed to talk, because they're working together, right? So yeah, they could talk. Maybe, right, looking at some of their verbal interactions might be something interesting to look at. And then as your other question was, why call the congratulations a cultural consequence? I guess we're assuming, like, over time, if they do engage in variable responding, we're going to see a recurrence of these types of IBCs that produce an aggregate product after this cultural consequence has been delivered on multiple occasions. I guess it could be a social consequence, but I guess the way we were conceptualizing it, yeah, you have the recurrence of IBCs and APs, and then followed by a cultural consequence that only appears as a result of their cooperation. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
This is Thomas. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm also Thomas.
Okay. Oh, you're also Thomas. Okay. Because there says Tracy Cihon. I know you're not Tracy, so I was just wondering what was your name. But so hey, Thomas. Yeah, I have one comment on the social reinforcer being also a cultural consequence, and that is a common criticism to some preparations in meta-contingency studies, in which some people will argue that why are we calling that cultural consequence while it could be functioning as a reinforcer? And I think that that's a very confusing thing, a confusing point in that experimental literature for people that are not aware of how exactly we conceptualize the cultural consequence there. In those preparations is the fact that, I mean, it is a functionally defined consequence, so it would be a consequence that selects exactly like you said, the recurrence of IBCs and an aggregate product. But of course, it doesn't mean that it cannot be at the same time a reinforcer to someone. And I don't see a big problem with that, although there could be an advantage in some future preparation to make some sort of preparation in which the cultural consequence is not acting as a reinforcer for particular participant or for the entire group. I don't know. That is a challenge, but I think all the preparations we have, you could have someone asking the exact same question. For instance, in the PUCI preparation, the Meta 3 preparation that I programmed for the Catholic University guys, it is a bonus points. So people have points and bonus points. And when bonus points appear, it appears for everybody. Points appear for one particular person, but you could also argue that the bonus appearing for each individual person is functioning as a reinforcer for each individual person. And that's fine. Again, the issue with the cultural consequences, what is it selecting? If it's selecting not only individual behavior, but a particular set of interlocking behavioral continuities, I would call it a cultural consequence. And that's basically it, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's always difficult to like parse out the effects of the individual contingencies versus the cultural ones. The cultural consequence, at least the way I'm thinking about it, is always to some extent kind of social, right? Because there's always a lot of people involved. So the arguments there, like, I don't know if we should be focusing right on its individual contingencies or its the cultural ones that we're arguing for. There's probably both going on. To say that it's just one or the other, something we're trying not to do over here, right? We're trying to explore both and like keep our minds open, right, to criticism, acknowledging what's going on at the operant level. And some of the preparations could be responsible for what it is we're studying, but yeah, good insight.
Thomas, it's interesting this point presented by Rita and Thomas. I remember the Mark discussing about collective leadership. And when Mark discussed about this literature, he present us verbal stimulus in antecedent condition and in consequence, and as consequence. For example, if you have antecedent as verbal stimulus that motivate the individual, and if you have consequence that motivate the individual too, we can consider the 2 points verbal stimulus. This is an interesting aspect when we consider social reinforcement in these congratulations as a cultural consequence. So I think and when Ramona considered again antecedent stimulus in a cultural milieu, again, she considers in her research group, again, rules, again, verbal stimulus. So I think we are all in this direction, consider verbal stimulus in our example, congratulations, as with the function of social reinforcement and a kind of cultural consequence because it's a feedback that you have.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I'm having the same thoughts on the antecedent side of things. The antecedent side of a culture, and it's still something I'm personally kind of struggling with. I'm not entirely sure how Ramona and colleagues are discussing that, but it's almost intuitive that there's things that happen before the culture, and whether or not they're rules or verbal stimuli every single time, something we could probably explore a little bit more.
Thomas, I'm not sure. Can you clarify a little bit more about the manipulation of the preceding stimuli in your experiment stimuli? It's more clear to me your conditions vary on the consequences, what is expected, but what is that? How do you vary? Is that you vary the instruction? What is the difference between your condition in reference to your discriminative stimuli?
Yeah, so in each of the conditions, right, the only thing that's changed, because the instruction stays the same throughout all three conditions, and then when we start to manipulate things on the antecedent side of things, we're changing the background color, right? So here we'll have the green presented, and then these are the contingencies we would, in theory, want to see, right? And then in the more stereotypic responding, we're presenting them with the red background. But as far as the instructions go, yeah, they're the same. I haven't thought about changing it. Maybe that's something we could probably discuss if that's something I should do. But as far as we have it now, the instructions are the same. You're trying to meet, get the congratulations, and get as many of those as you can.
Oh, I'm sorry I missed that. Yeah, thank you.
We have about 5 minutes if anyone wants to make any comments or questions.
I think I have some. Oh, okay.
If you go back to the slide that shows the different conditions, blue, red, green.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to make sure that I understand. You're saying, for example, in the green, no cultural consequence delivery if the IBC does not differ from the previous trial, but in red, no cultural consequence delivery if the IBC differs from the first one. So I'm just wondering why you're not kind of replicating from the prior every time, as opposed, why are you going back to the first one in the red condition, but just the previous trial in the green condition?
Yeah, so that's something we sort of looked at a little bit more recently, is that since we're trying to select for the more stereotypic IBCs in particular, whatever the participants are giving us on the first trial is, quote, what we're going to want to select, right? So it's the first trial because that's the first instance of responding, unlike the previous condition where the previous trial is according to the lag one. So it's just the previous trial. It doesn't have to be the first. In this condition down here, it's the first trial because that's where we're going to see responding, and that's where we would want to
see the replication.
Yeah.
So does that first trial receive the cultural consequence?
It has to, yeah, because they're gonna inevitably meet, and they will be met with the congrats.
Okay, I think I understand. I just wanted to make sure that I was clear on your instructions. Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
Can I ask something?
Sure.
I was just not sure if how was your aggregate product? How many squares of the board you had, or was any place on the board?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
When you were setting up the experiments, they have to meet somewhere in the board, and that would be the aggregate product, right?
Yes, the aggregate product.
How many squares of the board did you have the aggregate product?
Like how many possibilities of aggregate product meetings?
So could they meet everywhere in the board or in a specific area?
Oh no, they could in theory meet anywhere on the board as long as they're adhering to the rule of they do the night movement, so 2 squares in any direction, 1 down. So they could meet anywhere, right? Because we're trying to
Okay.
yeah.
So yeah, your the consequence then was for the IBCs,
Yes, on
but
the form or the topography of the
yeah,
IBC. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, would you say then that you were selecting for any aggregate product? I'm just confusing because not confusing, but I was just trying to understand because in the paper the 2 papers that you were referring to, like the areas where they could meet were systematically decreased, and then the specific area where they meet would be the aggregate product, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but what are you considering as your aggregate product?
The aggregate product would still be then meeting, but the
Yeah,
board isn't being constrained in subsequent trials. It's more about the form of the IBCs and how it is they get to their aggregate product, whether it's the same or different from before.
okay.
Yeah, what would happen if we restricted the board?
I was just wondering, thinking a little bit ahead, but if I was thinking that if you have like, for example, one area of the board as the aggregate product,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had to meet in that area, right?
Yeah.
And then they could meet in that area, like in a stereo, in a way that would always be the same, or if they had to vary for that, right? And then I was thinking that would be interesting as well to manipulate some in that kind of procedure to manipulate extinction for that specific aggregate product. That is, when would they stop actually meeting that specific area?
Yeah, exploring an extinction component or an intermittent schedule. We went with a lag 1 here to sort of explore variability, but we're aware
Yeah,
there's some other
yeah,
ways, right, to look at variability. An extinction condition would be pretty interesting. I know the Carvalho et al. Paper, I think, did include an extinction condition, but for the aggregate product, and I think
yeah. It included the extinction, but there wasn't this component that you were manipulating of have a restricted variability, which I think that's very interesting in the terms of extinction. Maybe when you are selecting for more variability on IBCs, maybe the extinction will look different than when you just let them meet in one specific and esterified way, right? You know. I know. I just think that was interesting. And I just one more question: why did you choose 15 trials instead of have a stability criteria as the other papers were having?
why 15 trials?
Yeah.
That was used in one of the previous, I think it was the Carvalho et al. Paper, where their control condition was just 15 trials. They meet anywhere on the, or they're allowed to meet anywhere on the board. There wasn't necessarily a time restriction.
Yeah.
It was just once they meet 15 times, then they're able to move on to the next condition. Unfortunately, we haven't run any pilot studies, so
Yeah.
I've done this on the side, like with friends or on my own, and it is fairly quick. So we
Yeah.
might make it, or we might add more trials if necessary, maybe in order to see a pattern of responding, right, and either the variability or rigidity condition.
Yeah.
But
So in that paper, there were two experiments, right? In the second one, I think that the number of trials were increased, and
yeah.
also the size of the board, because with like when you have a stability criteria with with less trials, you would have a stereotypy on the aggregate product, but the IBCs would not get stereotyped. So you also you also should look at the size of the board for that.
Yeah, and that's something we thought about exploring too. It gets either as big as we want, well, not as big as we want, but it gets pretty big. I think 12 by 12, and then as small as I think 6 by 6. But currently it's at an 8 by 8, so there's 64 cells. But yeah, that's definitely something we could probably explore. But unfortunately, we do have to transition to the next presenter. But just some closing thoughts. Those are great questions, by the way. Just some closing thoughts. Where my head was going with this is that there's a lot of groups out there that engage in some sort of coordinated behavior, and some of them are a little bit better at adjusting to changing contingencies than others, right? So they're not necessarily varying what I'm assuming are their IBCs in the way that they do things. So I thought this might be a cool way to sort of explore that sort of idea that there's a lot of ways to solve a problem, right, at the individual level, but we don't necessarily understand how that works at this level of analysis. So hopefully, right, this is a good starting point for that. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and let Carlos take over. Thank you all for listening.
Thomas, can I just a very quick comment?
Sure.
Just consider because in your condition A you have a reinforcing consequence, right?
Mm-hmm.
So eventually the participant will have a stereotyped pattern of IBCs. And then in condition C, it's just a suggestion that you choose a pattern that is the same for every pair of participants. Just consider this because if you do not have a pattern similar to every diet, you cannot compare the condition C and A because both will have a rigid pattern.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point.
Mm.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Carlos. Can everyone hear me? And can everyone see the screen? Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm a third year master student here at the University of North Texas, and I've been working alongside Tracy. Oh, I'm sorry, give me 1 second.
At the top, do stop share. Now do share screen.
Oh, okay, I see now. Sorry about that. Is that okay? Yes, so I'm a third year master student here at the University of North Texas. I've been working alongside Tracy for roughly around 3 years now. Just like Thomas, I was in her teaching sciences lab, focusing a little bit more on education here, teaching undergraduate students behavior principles course. And as soon as the cultural selection lab got started here, I decided that was gonna be something that I was really devote time to, because I was really interested in cultural analysis, and starting off with, of course, Dr. Glenn's work with the meta contingency. And after reading a little bit of the literature, I decided to devote quite some time there. So before going into my presentation, over the last several months, I've been working on an experiment that I was really interested in, and just as of yesterday, I decided to do some changes. So I would really appreciate any feedback you all have. Any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, because I'm gonna need as much help, not only because this is something new that I'm starting on, but it's also something that I would love to learn, especially me, since I haven't done any kind of cultural analysis experiments. So I would really appreciate the feedback. And I'm looking into, can cooperation be selected during an asymmetric iterative prisoner's dilemma game? So here is some of the social issues that got me interested first into the cultural analysis in general. As you can see here, we have violence, lack of education, pollution, famine. These are all typical things that you could see across the world, not just here in the United States. I remember my first thesis meeting with Tracy was me showing interest on all of this and how I wished we could take our behavioral and analytic principles and take it up to scale to try to fix these kind of issues. So the more I dived into the literature on how we could possibly do that with our behavior principles, I noticed that with all of this, one thing that's needed is cooperation when addressing any one of these issues, not just at the individual level, but in group levels as well. So we need different governmental agencies working along, nonprofit organizations, and nonprofit organizations working with many other organizations. Policy, so everything takes cooperation to hopefully address these issues. So that's something that I wanted to dive into the literature. And one of the things that I decided to pursue is how does cooperation, or what are the variables in society affecting cooperation as a whole? One of the things that I found was inequality, and there's a lot of people that argue that inequality is not only affecting cooperation, it also decreases cooperation amongst individuals and groups. So I decided to do a little bit of research on that. And here I just want to share a few statistics within the United States. And the reason why I used the United States is because it's one of the good examples of how inequality is affected throughout the entire country. And that's not to say, of course, that we don't see this across other countries, but it's just a good representation of it. The average American adult income in the United States is $66,100. Now that number is pretty okay here in the United States when you don't consider how many people are on that spectrum as far as the low income to the highest income. Now, if you break that down, there's approximately 117 million adults that make up the bottom 50% in the United States that earn $16,600. So this is essentially saying that half of the adults in this country are making way below that average of 66,000. And that's a good representation of how unequal the income is for the average citizen here in the United States. And also that the share of the national income for the top 1% is 1.6 times larger than the entire bottom 50%. So this is a good representation of how inequality is seen across the country and how this might affect the cooperation when dealing with those social issues. Now, before going into the experimental literature that I did some research on, I wanted to go over a little bit of the prisoner's dilemma game, just because they use that paradigm it's a really good paradigm to see how cooperation could be seen in the laboratory and how you can manipulate different variables to see how it affects cooperation as a whole. This is what a typical prisoner's dilemma game setup looks like. So you have a dyad that only has two choices. Each player only has two choices. The choice is either to cooperate or defect. And this example here on the table, green means cooperation, and yellow means defection. So if both players decide to cooperate, each one of them is going to receive 6 points. If both of them decide to defect, each one of them is going to receive 3. And ignore this here because I see now that that's a typo, and I'm sorry. This is actually going to be reversed. So it benefits the player to defect because they have a maximum payoff versus cooperation. So in this example, if player 1 decides to defect to yellow and player 1 decides to cooperate, it benefits player 1 because he or she receives 12 points versus 0 points. So the game is set up in a way where you want to defect, but cooperation is going to benefit both of those players. Now, in the experimental research that I did on equality, I did find 2 studies that combine the inequality and cooperation within the experimental setting of the prisoner's dilemma task. So the first, Cihon et al., 2007, we see that what they reference unequal or inequality, they reference it as asymmetric payoffs. So what they did was that on any kind of cooperation, one player was going to receive a higher point contingency than than the other player. Throughout the research for that study, they saw that there was a major reduction in the cooperation as the trials continued. The second study, Chatafau and Helbing 2010, also used the prisoner's dilemma task, and they manipulated inequality by creating a richer gets richer setup. And this was also a manipulation on inequality, but what they did was that in the onstart of every single trial or every single session, only one player initially got a higher or a greater point contingency, but not throughout the entire experiment. And what they saw was that cooperation was seen only on some participants at the beginning and eventually led to all participants' cooperation. So the difference between these two here is that the inequality for Anidol 2007 persisted throughout the entire prisoner's dilemma task, while the second study only created the inequity or the unequal point contingency at the beginning of the sessions. So all this research led me to my current experimental question, which is, can cooperation be selected during an asymmetric iterated prisoner's dilemma game? So what I'm going to bring to my experimental setup is I'm going to continue to use the iterated prisoner's dilemma game. I'm going to introduce the inequality throughout the entire experiment, favoring one player over the other. And I'm also going to introduce the cultural consequence on some of the selections that I'll be going into more detail about. My independent variable is going to be both the manipulation of the introduction of inequality and cultural consequence. So for the inequality, I'm going to favor one player by giving them greater points than the second player. My second manipulation is going to be the introduction of the cultural consequence, which is also going to be point contingencies for both players. My dependent variable is going to be the switching selection. So what that means is that the switching from both players are going to have to switch from one aggregate product to another aggregate product in 2 consecutive trials. So here you see the aggregate product green-green is going to be cooperation, to green-yellow, which means one of those players, the player that's going to have less points, is going to have to defect. And the dependent variable is going to be the switching between those 2 different aggregate products. And going back to what a traditional prisoner dilemma game is going to be an example of my first condition. And what that means is that if they both cooperate, they have both six points each, and if they both defect, it's going to be the minimal payoff for both, which is going to be 3 and 3. So what I'm going to be introducing, is going to be the inequality by adding 6 points to player 1. And this is going to be for any selection that he or she does, is going to get them 6 additional points on top of what player 2 is going to receive. And what that's going to look like is, as you can see here, comparing both of them, now if they both cooperate on green-green, player 1 is going to have a higher point value than player 1 is going to have a higher point value than player 2. So what the second manipulation that I'm going to be introducing is the cultural consequence. So given this is going to be with the new point contingency, where it's going to be favoring player 1. But on the top 2 aggregate products here, you see that they're the complete opposite. So if both player 1 and player 2 decide to cooperate, player 1 is going to have the highest value. But just adjacent to it, if player 1 decides to cooperate and player 2 decides to defect, player 2 is going to get the higher value. So what I'm going to hopefully do, and what this setup I'm going to assume what this setup is going to do, is that we're going to start beginning to see cooperation deter, or the player 2 is going to begin to defect. Well, what I want to do is have a switch between these 2 consecutive 2 trials. That way, they'll both be having equal points if they go back and forth between green-green cooperation and cooperation, and then green-yellow cooperation and defection. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on what exactly that would look like. So the way I would do this is by introducing the cultural consequence for the consecutive switching between both of them. And here you could see this is going to be the new values if they produce the aggregate product within those 2 consecutive trials, and the cultural consequence added to those. So on here, this table is going to represent different trials and how I'm going to be delivering the cultural consequence to both players and the cumulative points that they're going to be earning throughout the entire game. So this is going to be an example if the very first option that they have is player 1 decides to defect and player 2 decides to cooperate. Player 1 is going to receive 18 points with a current cumulative points of 18. Player 2 is going to receive 0 points and beginning with 0 points as well. So as soon as you see here that they do a complete switching, you also see the cumulative points, and you also see each one gets 6 and 12. So as the trials continue, I'm going to be delivering the cultural consequence depending on the switching for these 2 consecutive trials. So if I'm getting a GY, the next one is going to be a GG. That's when each person gets the cultural consequence, which is going to be an additional 3 points. So it's going to be 6 points overall divided by both players, which each player is going to receive 3 points. And this is going to continue throughout the session. And as you can see here, the cultural consequence is only going to be delivered upon the switching from green-green to green-Y, or vice versa. So in this first example, you see a switch from green-yellow to green-green, cultural consequence is delivered. Second one is green-green to green-Y, cultural consequence is delivered. Now, as you see in these examples here, there is a switch from green-Y to green-green, a cultural consequence is delivered, and immediately the next one is going to be a green-Y, so you're also going to have a cultural consequence. So what you see here is that as they begin to switch, first player 1 or player 2 is going to have the higher value, so whenever they do switch, the second person is going to have the higher value. And if you take a look at the cumulative points across both players, they start, what you see if you do not switch between those is that the gap starts increasing. So the richer person per se is going to get increasingly richer if they don't have these 2 consecutive trials here. And what you do see is once they start producing these 2 and 2 consecutive trials, you'll start to see these 2 cumulative points, the gap between those 2 cumulative points start decreasing. And as you can see here, once they do end the trial at 123 to 111, this gap will hopefully decrease with the delivering of the cultural consequence between them. Yes, so there will always be a gap, given that at any other selection besides green-green or green-yellow, it's going to automatically create a gap between those 2 cumulative points, because in this current setup, it's always going to depend on the richer player to cooperate. The minute that he or she decides to defect, it's going to create a discrepancy or a gap between those 2 cumulative points. So hopefully what I'm attempting to do is deliver the cultural consequence and select the switching between the green-Y and green-green in order to keep that gap from getting any greater. And my current experimental design would be introducing just the prisoner's dilemma game with the regular points, and then switching to favoring player 1, going back to the regular game, favoring player 1, hopefully to see cooperation in this condition, non-cooperation, cooperation, and then non-cooperation again. And then, and only then, will I introduce the cultural consequence to hopefully see the increase of the cooperation compared to the favoring player 1 condition. And eventually, I also want to switch over the favoring points to player 2, and also do a reversal for that. And moving forward, hopefully I want to do a little bit more research on the evaluation on the point contingency to see if the current points are the most effective for the current setup that I'm attempting to create. The second one is do a little bit more research on the current literature, because the most recent literature that I had was 2010. And there could be a lot more literature out there that can assist me in implementing this experiment. And lastly is design the program itself. Thomas, as you could see, could give you a little bit more examples of what that's going to look like, but I have not yet created the program. The program that I currently have right now was to answer a different experimental question. So hopefully if you do have any suggestions on what kind of program is best for my current experimental question, I would really appreciate that. And that's all I have as of right now. So I can open it up to any questions or suggestions from anyone.
Hey, Carlos, this is John Crispin again.
Hi.
Have you thought about using some kind of a discriminative stimulus? For example, if green has been played, presenting a color that signals to the players that now if you switch patterns to green-yellow, then the cultural consequence is available. Have you given that any thought, or were you planning to just use, let them play out the game without any discriminative stimulus that might let them know that this switch is available, the cultural consequence is available if this switch occurs?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. As of right now, I haven't really thought about the discriminative stimuli signaling the switch. That is an interesting idea because at first, of course, I want to see if the cultural consequence even could select that. And I was also thinking if both players are going to be able to talk with each other. So I think moving forward, I would possibly just use the cultural consequence. And if I do not see any selection, or if I don't see the recurrence of the switching, maybe the discriminative stimuli might be the next step moving forward.
Yeah, I noticed that. I thought of discriminative stimuli because, in fact, when you were presenting the different conditions, every time the switch occurred, you highlighted it in red. And I thought,
okay. Yeah, so that might be a really good idea to get that, especially if we don't see any of the switching occur within, let's say, a first few trials. Maybe that might be the next step, or maybe a more effective way and a quicker way to get them to switch back and forth.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yep.
Hi, Carlos.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, I'm Marcelo. Benvenuti. Congratulations for your project. I appreciate you to hear that. Very interesting. I may ask you a question and a suggestion. In fact, my concern with your design is related to your baseline conditions, because the literature on the prisoner dilemma game shows that you may find very different patterns of behavior in these conditions. And my concern is if you find some participants that are cooperative and some others that are not.
Correct.
What do you think about this? Will be a problem for you?
Yeah, because that's actually something that I've been wondering, because in the literature that I've been researching, there has been some studies where they do cooperate right off the bat, and in my instance, I wouldn't really need a cultural consequence for that cooperation to occur, because they might have switched back and forth without me even introducing that condition. So that's actually something that I really haven't thought about how I would handle if I do get participants in the lab and they begin to do that without me even introducing that condition.
All right. Well, one suggestion here is to deal with not fixed values of distributions. Maybe you can manipulate the values of distributions to generate a single baseline. A single baseline, for example, when no one of the participants cooperate between each others. Just a suggestion.
Are you saying on the individual points themselves?
Yes. To force to generate non-cooperation patterns.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting thing, because if they do start off cooperating, then maybe I'd have to shift the cooperation to non-cooperation and then see if I could switch it back, given my manipulations after that.
All right, great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I can also have a suggestion related to two different preparations that played with inequality. One is the Vicky experiment that the required IBC was unequally distributed, the payoff. And another preparation is a totally different study that tried to replicate Lane and Androni's experiment with pigeons, the symbolic aggression in the pigeon. So, you know, a friend of mine recently ran the experiment, and I programmed the experiment actually. And the pigeons didn't have a cumulative score for points or for grains eaten, but the humans had in that preparation. And what happened is she didn't get the same result as the pigeons because they wouldn't, you know, aggress, they wouldn't sort of defect or make the other person's condition. I don't know if you're familiar with that experiment, Lane and Andronis.
Correct.
You are?
Yes. Are you saying?
Okay, what happened, so what happened in that experiment is that people were extremely sensitive to inequality, in the sense that the person ahead would sometimes make sure he lost points to get the other one to match the amount of points. And also, when Martoni tried to replicate Vicky experiment, he couldn't, because people were also very, very sensitive to inequality, and they wouldn't, you know, distribute unequally the same way they distribute equally the points, and so on and so forth. So I'm just, I don't know if it's a suggestion or what, but what I'm trying to say is that you might run into some problems with the cumulative score that you may maybe prevent if you just don't show them the total score. Just let them play and get points per trial. Maybe each one sees their total, but they don't necessarily see the total of the other player. I don't know if, you know,
yeah,
that's an idea.
That's actually something very interesting, because I did run across some studies that suggested the visibility of the other player's cumulative score was the variable causing, or the variable attributing to the inequality. So whenever I was first thinking about my setup was, I would want to include that on the visibility side for both players, hopefully to get that non-cooperation. But of course, and correct me if I'm wrong, was the Vicky study where the players had the option to distribute the wealth after the IBCs and aggregate product, correct?
Yeah, sort of like the aggregate product was the distribution, but they were not aware. So the task was betting on some column, and so like they bet online, and the computer chose the column, not the computer, because it was with a paper board, and it was like the participant was choosing a random column, but it wasn't random at all, in the sense that the column was based, for the bets was based on how they distributed on the previous trial. So the cultural consequence was actually contingent on the equal or unequal distribution. Mm-hmm. So he had like shifting conditions from they had to distribute equally, and then they had to distribute unequally. Okay. And it's really easy to get the equal distribution, but unequal, there were some other studies that could not replicate. That's what I'm trying to say. So unequal points, it's very controlling, and it's sort of like a, yeah, I don't know, just concern of mine that you might run into some problem with with that and still have people cooperating when they are not in similar points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for that, because that's something that I'm actually looking forward to. Even in my previous study that I was attempting to run is hopefully all of this, my pilot participants would kind of give me a clue into what I need to manipulate. And if I do, per se, see many of the pilots start cooperating right away, maybe that's something I need to address in my design as well. Thank you. Also, we have 5 minutes before our next presenter. So if anyone else wants to ask some questions.
I had a quick thought, and I apologize because I came in late. Did you say your name is Carlos?
Carlos, yes.
All right, Carlos. I'm Brian Silva. I'm at UT San Antonio. And yeah, this from what I saw, I know I came in the middle. This looks like a very interesting experiment. And I may say something that has missed some details, so please feel free to correct me here. I study reinforcement of variability and lag schedules, so I think about that a lot. And as I saw your slide where you talked about cultural consequences being delivered for switching between the GY, GG and GY patterns, I immediately thought about lag schedules. I wondered if you had considered that literature, or if you had conceived of that manipulation of the cultural consequences differentially reinforcing variability in aggregate products, and it just came to mind, so I thought I'd throw that idea out.
Yeah, no problem. So I think you might have missed the previous one, but my colleague is actually looking into lag schedules. And I don't know too much about lag schedules, but for at least my manipulation here is, give me 1 second, going back here. The only switching that I would want to create in my manipulation is between these two here. So I'm not sure if the lag, so let's say, for example, if in the first one, in the first selection would be green, green. They do have the opportunity to choose yellow, yellow, or green, yellow, or yellow, green. So I wouldn't want to select any one of those or reinforce any of those possibilities. The only two that I'm actually trying to reinforce with the cultural consequence or select would be these two here. So I'm not sure if the lag schedule would allow or would produce any of the other selections. Because the only variation I would want is between those two specific.
Yes. So I think I'm just a suggestion. It might be conceptualized as like a lag schedule with restrictions. Cultural consequences delivered contingent on going from, let's say, like green GG to GY, right? So do
Correct.
GY and then GY again and get the cultural consequence.
Yes, so it'll be any selection between those two aggregate products. So if you do start at the GG, it would be immediately to the GY.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Just wanted to toss that idea out there.
Yeah, thank you.
So, sure.
Any further questions?
Carlos, congratulations for the experiment. We have a doctoral experiment of Maiana, I shouldn't, of mine, and we are trying to see the effects of verbal interactions and the relation between cost and benefit in aggregate and cooperative aggregate products. And we have 4 players in our dilemma game, and I would like to comment with you only a point that we are seeing in our first results is that with 4 players, if we have one competitive player with this kind of strategy, competitive strategy, we can generate high variability in the quartet. And other parameters that we are seeing very interesting is rules generated by them, these 4 players, and the last one is the history of exposition between conditions. So this is how I will send to you our first results and our design to discuss with you some points, and this can, I think, can be very important for us and can contribute to you to think about some points in this design. Thank you.
No, thank you. I would really appreciate that, because that's actually something that I was considering if I would ever want to move from 2 players to 4 players. And also, I always have in the back of my head is I'm going into this experiment expecting for it to go flawlessly. Of course, it's my first experiment, and I've been told that it's probably not going to go that way. So maybe all this variability that I'm speaking, that I'm trying to stay away from, is probably what I'm going to be getting from not only my pilots but my participants. So I would really appreciate the data if you did send that, to see what are the possibilities that I might be running into in my first couple of participants or few participants.
We are replicating Sampaio 2016, and we are working with economists that are doing some how can I say in economy language, a kind of shaping that they can preview the pattern of choice, having this design that we are using in Dilemma game. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. I really appreciate it.
I have one thing that I want to say, and that's, if your experiment doesn't work perfectly in the beginning, that's a really good thing.
Right.
And this is going to be true for all of the projects that you all are doing. You do not want to have an experimental question that you know is going to produce particular results. And that's actually something to step back and look at. Is there uncertainty here? Because if there's no uncertainty, it doesn't matter. Then your study's not important. So you want to do something that could go multiple ways, and if it doesn't go the way you expect, that's great. Then you look at the data you've got and redesign. And that's all I'm going to say probably all day. So I will leave the screen again.
Oh, no, thank you for
Nice work. Very nice work.
you. That's actually encouraging words, because as I've said, these are things that I think about. So it's good to know that if it doesn't go well, that's what I want to see. So thank you for that. Yeah, so now we're going to switch to Stephanie, and she'll be telling you a little bit about her project. Thank you.
Hello. I'm just going to switch over. And then, oh no, this. No. Do I go to? Oh, I lost it. There it is.
Share.
Okay. Should have given a better name. Okay. Can you guys see it? And then. Oh, a little slow. There we go. Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Cran, and like these guys, I'm also a graduate student. And what kind of got me into this area of research is similar to Carlos. I really enjoyed the application of behavior analysis to larger scale behavior change. And specifically, a lot of my interest came from environmental sustainability as I looked through the research, and found that I wanted to kind of approach the topic through first looking at what can we do for environmental sustainability, specifically food production methods, as they contribute a lot to the issue. So I'll go a little bit over the overview, because I'm going to be coming from a few different areas of application to kind of describe the issue that I'm talking about. So first, I'll be talking about food insecurity in the United States, and then how policy, agriculture, and socioeconomic status affects food access, thus creating the issue of food insecurity and also environmental sustainability issues pertaining to climate change, and how we can use and how we can use community gardens to, or could we use community gardens to address some of these problems, which I'll go into best practices, why aren't we using community gardens as much, talk about an internship that I did in Dallas, and pose a couple ideas for future research. Is it loud enough?
I think just project your voice a little bit more.
Okay. And a couple of those ideas are using matrix analysis or looking at some of the attitudes pertaining to community gardens by members within the community where they would be placed. So food security as a socially significant issue, it is defined as it exists whenever the availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods or the ability to acquire acceptable food in socially acceptable ways is limited or uncertain. And there are a few, there are many negative health outcomes, both physical and psychological, that can come from food insecurity: birth defects, anemia, depression and anxiety, oral health, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. And the USDA splits these two areas of, splits food security into two different subsections. Low food security, that just, that mostly affects the individual's ability to access healthy foods, not necessarily the amount of foods. And very low food security, those individuals are, they have a reduced food intake, but also low access to things like fresh foods, more processed foods are available to them. So since 1995, the USDA has been doing an annual survey to, doing an annual survey to look at food insecurity rates. Let me get the pointer here, I think that's it. So the blue line here indicates food insecurity at both low and very low food insecurity. On the x-axis, we have the year, and the y, we have percentage of households experiencing this phenomenon. And you can see that since 1995, rates have kind of gone up and down, but right now, as of 2017, rates are similar to as they were in 1995. And between 2007 and 2009, there was an increase due to the Great Recession. Excuse me. And you can, this visual just demonstrates that those experiencing food insecurity most are those experiencing poverty. And a few other single women with children are also highly affected by this. So I'm going to go into how food policy, agriculture, and access to fresh foods kind of play in together to kind of give you guys a diagram to show how these all come together to produce food insecurity and also environmental sustainability issues. So first, I'm going to go into food policy. Since the 50s, the kind of the goal of food production has been quantity more than anything. So this larger type kind of shows the outcome of this with just some support with this smaller type, and then the outcome of that being corn, the production of corn, soybeans, and canola. So a lot of agricultural policies have financially supported the production or the mass production of a few different crops, so that being corn, soybeans, and canola. And money for research to produce these crops in a fast and cheap way has led to a lot of money being given for research and technology, given for research and technology in grain and oilseed production, as well as meat and dairy production, and that means less goes to fresh vegetable production. And that has been made to address the growing urban population, and it's, like I said, more production driven. Next, we have how that affects agriculture. So in order to meet the high demands to feed the growing population, a lot of farmers stopped growing multiple crops on one tract of land. Instead, they specialized in probably one large tract of land would just grow corn. So there's a lot of low biodiversity, which then puts them up against a lot of pests and disease. And in order to address that, it's kind of like a vicious cycle going on. They use fertilizers and pesticides to address this problem, which then pollutes the waterways, growing just one crop depletes the nutrients specifically for that crop in the soil. So they have to bring fertilizer to artificially bring back those nutrients. And then they also, since they're such large tracts of land, that produces land erosion. And in order to use those large tilling machines, they use a lot of fossil fuels. And then as a result of this, we are seeing 20 to 30% of greenhouse gases are contributed to our food production methods in the United States. And last, I will talk about how socioeconomic status affects food access, kind of bringing together this issue of food insecurity. So the low production cost of these largely produced foods through subsidies thus makes a lower cost to the consumer. So the individuals who are living in the poorer neighborhoods as opposed to the more wealthy neighborhoods have more access to convenience stores, and in convenience stores, those have the more processed foods. They are cheaper to them, they're in closer proximity as opposed to grocery stores, which have healthier options, though they are farther away. So that overall, that limits the access to these foods. Fewer healthy options are available, which then leads to all kinds of health issues, because a lot of these processed foods contain high fats and sugars. They are nutritionally low quality, but they still have the same calories. So that's why this issue is related to obesity, because it's not necessarily the lack of access to food, it's more the food that these individuals are consuming. So this all comes together in this larger graphic. The three areas come together to produce food insecurity. And then the other two, so these two also, food policy and agriculture, then result in unsustainable methods for food production and producing climate change. So we read through the literature, we wanted to see what's something that can address maybe both of these problems in a way, and could they help address it? So we came upon literature on community gardens. And a community garden is a land collectively gardened for the specific purpose of growing fruits, vegetables, and/or herbs for self-consumption. So some ways that community gardens address some of the issues I was describing earlier. So you can see our conventional methods, that being our mass production of single crops. As opposed to that, so community gardens, the gardeners themselves are the producers, and it can actually come at a lower cost than compared to grocery store prices. And since community gardens are typically closer in proximity to these neighborhoods, the fresh fruits and vegetables are in their neighborhoods, they're easier to access than having to go to the grocery store. And then the way that this addresses environmental sustainability is that more organic and environmentally sustainable methods are typically used in community gardens, such as crop rotation. And so that also hand tillage avoids having to use these heavy machines that use a lot of fuel. And other organic methods such as composting to keep the nutrients in the ground. So community gardens sound great, but so why aren't they everywhere? It might be a really nice way to address some of these issues, but there are a few barriers that I'll talk about next. So a few studies look at some of the barriers, and these tend to be some of the main ones that they find to it. So growing fruits and vegetables is time consuming. Not only that, but getting everybody together to cooperate to regularly tend to these gardens, to cultivate, takes a lot of time, and it requires a lot of leadership. Depending on the size of the garden, you have to manage a lot of individuals who are growing these crops. And then just a few issues with even getting community gardens started up. It can be difficult to access land due to different legal issues, policies that say, such as, I know in Dallas, Texas, you can't grow a garden if you don't have a certificate of occupancy. And so the only way to get around that is if there's already an existing structure. So but what works best for a community garden is an empty plot of land. So you kind of have to go around that and get the correct zoning and all the go around the policies to get your land started up. Financial resources, even just getting them started up and maintaining them, requires quite a bit of money, such as in Dallas, Texas, water meters can cost from $1,800 to $2,500. And just overall startup, getting the plots in there, getting the access to the seeds can cost quite a bit of money. And lack of technical knowledge, a lot of just knowing how to grow crops efficiently without creating a lot of food waste takes a lot of technical knowledge. So having access to people who can teach the gardeners that can be somewhat difficult. So what we wanted to do then to overcome some of these barriers were identify some of the best practices. So we wanted to identify major classes and actors and their actions that maintain the present situation. So with this, we looked at the literature to see what are the best practices that are necessary to run a garden sufficiently to keep one going. Because one of the issues is that these gardens will start up and within the first year or two, they may shut down. So maintenance of these, keeping them going is very important. So after that, here is this giant graph. And so the lime green circles are the actors, the teal circles are the sectors, the orange squares are infrastructure, and then we also identified some of these supporting practices. And then additionally, these pink arrows and the blue arrows, I started to mess around to look at what are the contingencies that are maintaining these best practices. So you can see here, the community garden is in the middle. And then, for example, managing the garden itself requires a person or a group of people to manage the volunteers, which then leads to the gardeners volunteering, which maintains the community gardens. So I was just playing around with that a bit. It can be pretty cumbersome to look at, but this is what we've identified so far. And so next I wanted to talk about the Dallas Coalition for Hunger Solutions and how they have addressed food insecurity in their area. I actually did an internship earlier this year there and learned quite a bit about what's going on, particularly for Dallas, because the issue is that a lot of policies is different for each county. So I wanted to specifically find one county and see what's going on over there. So what they do, they help overcome some of these barriers in community gardening. What they do is they attend a lot of workshops and a lot of meetings in the city to help amend some of the codes to make it easier for gardeners to start up their gardens and maintain them. For example, in 2017, they helped amend a code that makes it so that community gardens can have easier access to growing plots of land, to having the wooden structures, and they wouldn't have to get a permit for it, which can be very time consuming and expensive. They also connect a lot of the gardeners to monetary resources to maintain their gardens, such as they connect, like Home Depot in Dallas County, they provide a lot of the supplies to the gardeners, so the coalition helps them get in contact with them to get those resources also through grants and scholarships. And they have a garden locator app where they connect community members because they found the need. A lot of people from the community who didn't necessarily garden were approaching them, and they said, we have a need for finding community gardens. How can I help? So they created this garden locator app that makes it a lot easier for the users to find these gardens. And they also hold a lot of gardening workshops. And so my largest role in this internship was conducting an annual urban garden survey, and then after that making a very user-friendly report for them to use. Because a lot of the gardeners expressed an interest in wanting to know what's going on, because though there are a lot of people trying to help this issue of food insecurity, there are a lot of barriers. Not only the barriers I mentioned earlier, but also that a lot of them report they just don't know what's going on. So we're trying to kind of create more of a community in that way, just to show what it's looking like in Dallas County. And so to address best practices, the coalition, they also provide a guide for getting started. So this is their version of best practices. And in addition, they provide a lot of information for specific addresses, who to go see about policies, who to go see to get water meters, who to contact. So they take a lot of that time out of the gardeners' need to go find that out for themselves. And so they provide a flowchart with some of the similar best practices that I found. And this is a way that it's just a very easy, user-friendly way for these gardeners to start up their garden. It's actually 2 potential research directions. We took out one yesterday. So the first idea, so what we started out with, we were very interested in how can we describe this issue? How do we even diagram the best practices going on, and how can we apply that to a few gardens, specifically in Dallas County, because that's how we, through that garden survey, I identified a few gardens that fit addressing this issue of food security. So we were thinking of conducting an ethnographic study in order to produce a matrix analysis. And so we would identify the interdependencies of sectors maintaining the community gardens. That being, we would go to 3 different gardens in Dallas County and just take a multi approach to figuring out what is the context under which this garden is maintaining. And so we wanted to find a few gardens possibly that show that they've maintained, that being that they've run for three or more years, and that they grow they grow at least twice a year, that they cultivate fruits and vegetables, and that they feed the community around them, not necessarily just the gardeners, but also the people within their community. And the second potential research direction, we wanted to kind of look at, one of the barriers that appears to be very significant is the community support, both by people who don't garden and also just getting the gardeners themselves to come in and to maintain their status as a volunteer. And so what we wanted to look at, how can we study the attitudes about community garden from the members of these communities themselves? And so one of the methods that we were looking into, so we were thinking of doing pre and post measures of the implicit, the IRAP, and a part of that would be to do a free write, just to kind of see, before we share the information about, what all the benefits of community garden and how can they address some of the food insecurities in their area, how are some of their attitudes reflected through a free write and also from presentation of multiple examples of community gardens. And so something that could be a little bit more local here in Denton, we were thinking of looking at different apartment complexes, because food insecurity is also a big issue out here. And neighborhood empty land space, actually, in Tracy's neighborhood. They have a tract of land that's available, but just that's how we got that idea of just there's a lot of land out here that we could use. And then also just maybe possibly approaching grocery shoppers, because some of the literature that we found, even people don't want to, for example, eat out of a garden because they think the food is dirty. So just seeing like what exactly is going on is to produce this kind of a barrier. And here are my references, and that's it. And so we have some time for any questions. And like I said, we're pretty new to this. We've been changing our methods around a bit. So any sort of feedback, any ideas, what you guys think we could use with this information would be very helpful. Okay. Yeah. So Yeah, so one of the things that we were thinking of doing with this matrix analysis was, like I said before, approaching a few of the gardens in the area, and with the information that we find, we compare that to the best practices we found. But the issue with this is that gardens take time. The cultivation process takes a lot of time. So doing an experimental analysis with the matrix analysis is more time consuming and possibly not as accessible to us. So we were trying to find a couple different ideas for an experimental manipulation that we could use with this information.
Hi, this is Maria. I enjoy very much your presentation and everybody's presentation, by the way. You guys are doing a terrific job. I was wondering if you could look at community gardens as a common pool resource, because it is a resource that is shared and that it has subtracted properties. So some people take out, if one abuses more of the garden or takes more, it affects the others. So one thing that it might be interesting is to look at Ostram's management principles and compare the community gardens based on those principles in terms of some sort of variables to see which are the most effective ones, and whether some of those principles relate to good management. Also, and she talked about these variables, also the exogenous variables that she calls, identify unique characteristics to, I know, like for the area where I live, that the gardens in one area have different totally properties than in others, and that will affect how those gardens are managed. So anyhow, that's just an idea.
Yeah, definitely. Common pool resources was something that we definitely tossed around, and we can look more into that research. Definitely. Thank you. Yeah, there's multiple approaches to go to this, so we're trying to figure out which one we want to play with the most.
Hi. I saw one of your last slides that you would like to use the IRAP technology. I was just going to ask you how you are thinking to use it, how you hope to get from that.
Yeah, good question. So we found that a lot of barriers to this are getting the community members involved in the first place. And so the literature doesn't really tell us why they're not, there are a few different ideas, such as the amount of time they have to put into it, the attitudes about whether they actually would eat the foods or whether they're beneficial for their time. So we kind of just wanted to see what's going on and why possibly the people in grocery stores prefer to get their produce there as opposed to a much less expensive way of attaining it through community gardens. Thank you.
I particularly, of course, like the matrix approach that you're trying to develop. And this could be a nice example, because it's a relatively contained example, a nice example of looking at the level of complexity that actually plays out when you look at the number of actors and the number of practices that need to be established, not just to begin the project, but to sustain it. And there are potentially some important lessons about sustainability in general that can come, I think, from that kind of analysis. So I encourage you to do it. It will be a challenging study, certainly, but it's going to be a challenging life when we're all faced with these issues anyway. So I just encourage you.
Thank you. And I've definitely stuck more toward that one because it has captured my interest the most, just because I want to see what it is that's going on. How do all these actors and sectors come into place to you know, there are great examples of community gardens out there, but exactly what is going on that makes them successful, being whether they have certain specialties to them. We've looked at a few community gardens already, specifically one in Denton here, because we have actually the largest amount of acres for a community garden. It's through Shiloh Field, and we were playing around with those interdependencies and seeing that one of the major players in that is it is a church-based. The land was donated through the church, and a lot of the funding comes from a man who attends that church. So that might be something that's just specific to that garden. So we wanted to explore that a little bit more and see, you know, is this something that are these variables similar to other ones? Because some of the other gardens that I know of, when I was doing my internship in Dallas, I found that a lot of them were not faith-based communities. Some of the other ones were master gardeners associations or school gardens. So where a lot of the support is coming from varies greatly, but we wanted to get down to some of those main variables that support them. We have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if you could go back to the slide where you brought together all the sources of insecurity. I think there was one before. That. Okay, so
I can zoom in on any of them too.
right. Okay. So under food policy, and I guess what I'm just sort of looking for is there in this conglomeration the kinds of factors that we just saw, the Trump administration with their new FDA regulations that are going to throw 3.1 million people off of so-called food stamps and increase food insecurity tremendously. And so I'm wondering where here that might be. I'm not sure I saw it, and I wonder whether that needs to be added in as well, because that's going to affect school lunches and all sorts of issues, and maybe make community gardening even more important.
Definitely. Through a lot of my readings that I was doing from other fields, I was finding a lot on food assistance programs and how those have changed over the year, and I could definitely add a lot of that information in there. Because there is data on it from the USDA as well that could be added to that graph earlier, sort of like a timeline. And that's something that we looked into kind of in the beginning as well. But we tried narrowing them down to just a few different points because a lot comes into play for this issue.
Mm-hmm. Hard to know where to stop.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. You'd have seen some of my other diagrams. All right, and then I'm gonna bring it over to Tracy. Thank you, guys.
There we go. Thank you so much. We have just about 10 more minutes for more general questions, or if we wanted to shift back to any other presentations or any closing thoughts or more general comments, I'm happy to moderate a little bit. Well, then I will close. It has been a great pleasure to have all of you here to help us with our research and to really be thinking about some of the issues that we're addressing. It's a complicated area as we start to address so many social issues, starting to think about cultural level of selection, how we might be able to play in this area, and we appreciate all of the support. What we've been able to do today is give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the work that we have up and coming. We do have several other projects that we'd be happy to share with you at other times when we're all available. And we are currently scheduled to have our next meeting on August, our next large meeting like this on August something or other. I don't remember exactly, maybe the 21st. LIRC's group was planning to present, but they've run into a couple of barriers to being prepared to be able to do that. And so if we do decide to have the meeting in August, we would need someone maybe to give us some papers to read to discuss, or another lab to present some of their research, or some other sort of opportunity for us to come together and collaborate coordinate and work together again before we all get really busy with the onset of another academic year. I think I just said before we all get really busy, and saying that to this group is probably funny. So if you're interested in sharing something with a larger group or contributing to that, or have an idea for how we might be able to construct our next larger group meeting, just send those to me via email. You all know how to find me one way or another. I will, at the end of this meeting, package the recording from the presentations today, in addition to the slides that were shared with you with the presenters. And I will make all those things available, sending a link out that hopefully works this time with the assistance of one of my wonderful graduate students who will help me with all of my technology needs because I don't know how to manage them. So I would just like to close by giving Thomas, Stephanie, and Carlos a really big round of applause. They were really brave to present today before they have any data collection or pilot. And thank you all for being here to support us and for your attention today. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Great job, you guys. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.